but I'm sorry also that I couldn't join you live because of the time difference. I think this is a very important discussion because we know that what this pandemic has done has created a very different world, but a world that is different in almost predictable ways. What COVID-19 and the lockdowns and then the subsequent patterns of behavior and of economic outcomes have done is really to accelerate certain changes and certain tendencies in the global economy that were already of great concern. There is the inherent tendency of the global economy to stagnation, which we have seen really after the global economic crisis. The fact that the recovery has been a very halting and fragile one, and that the supposed green shoots that people kept seeing in the global economy never really materialized because to enable sustained expansion other than in a few pockets of the world. What the pandemic has done is to expose the lack of resilience of that kind of economic recovery. So it's not just a question of health resilience or societal resilience. It is now a question of economic resilience. The fact that the economy is actually so fragile, so vulnerable, and so potentially open to shocks. And let's face it, the pandemic is just the beginning. This is a relatively small shock compared to the much more existential threats that are coming with climate change, some of which are already upon us, especially in many parts of the developing world and in tropical areas in particular. So I think that's the first point. The second is that this was a deeply unequal world, socially but economically more. This inequality was already extremely high before the global financial crisis. It increased after the crisis. The pandemic has actually dramatically increased it even further. People are talking of not a V or a W or an L or a U-shaped recovery, but a K-shaped recovery, with the K, the upper line of the K being very, very small. A very small proportion of the global economy is actually doing rather well. Giant digital companies, the extremely wealthy have actually seen their wealth increase and their profits increase over this period. Whereas most of the global economy, most of the people in the world are actually facing very extreme vulnerability and growing material distress. So inequality, which was already rampant, has been dramatically accentuated by this pandemic and by the policy responses. One aspect of the policy response that I want to highlight is precisely the fiscal responses across developed and developing countries. In the advanced economies, suddenly they rediscovered the joys of fiscal expansion. The post-global financial crisis recovery had been led by monetary policy, by very, very loose credit, by the greatest expansion of liquidity that the world has ever seen. And if that didn't really do the trick, and many of us had been saying that you have to have an expansionary fiscal policy, and we were always told, no, this is impossible, it will have too many negative effects. Suddenly in the advanced economies, that doesn't seem to be a problem. Developed country governments are spending 20% of GDP, 15%. I mean, pretty much everybody is spending 10% or more as a way of fighting this pandemic and the economic outcomes of the lockdowns and the closures. In the developing world, things are very different. In the developing world, in fact, there's been very little in terms of this kind of fiscal expansion. Even the countries that have declared fairly large fiscal expansion have done much less. And in fact, if you look just at the G20 countries, the G12 of that have spent much less in the post-pandemic situation than they did after the global financial crisis. The countries that have announced very big packages, India announced 10%, the real fiscal expansion, even the expected fiscal expansion was only 1%. Even that amount has not been fully spent. South Africa announced 6%, it's only about 3.5% has been spent. So there are many developing countries that have really not responded adequately to this crisis. And this is because partly there are concerns about sovereign debt, there are concerns about capital flight and how private markets will respond, and particularly the credit rating agencies, which they will generate a downgrade. But there are also self-inflicted wounds. The Washington consensus has been unfortunately internalized in many of our countries. Governments are now obsessed with the idea that they cannot run large fiscal deficits, even in a crisis like this, when all sources of effective demand other than public spending have collapsed. And so it's this internal pressure which actually has given even a greater amount of negative impact on developing countries. So there is a very sharp divide now in terms of policy responses, which is adding to the spatial inequality that I talked about earlier. The third big, I would say, intensification, because it was a tendency that was already occurring, is to do with the nature of work and the increasing automation of many production processes and distribution processes. This was already a very big tendency. People were talking about the impact of the fourth industrial revolution, of automation, of artificial intelligence on employment. But now it's actually much more severe because the pandemic has laid bare that a lot more work can be done remotely or digitally. And many things which earlier it was sort of perceived that it's important to have face-to-face interactions and an office kind of situation and so on. Many of those are now being conducted digitally, and companies are thinking, well, why not? It's much cheaper. They are saving on a whole range of expenses, including those of running offices with large numbers of people in them. And people are saving a lot of time in commuting, which was earlier seen as a basic part of what they had to do, even though it was not defined as work, but in the statistics often defined as leisure. In fact, it was essentially a significant addition to most people's work time. At one level, this increases productivity. At another level, it actually also destroys a lot of activities. And those activities, really, many of them will not come back. I don't think, for example, the travel industry is going to ever recover, the broader travel industry, both local and national and international. I don't think that is going to recover to the same levels of pre-pandemic, even in the next few years. And similarly, there will be many other sectors which are not likely to recover in exactly the same way. So the employment crisis, which was already acute, is going to get far more acute. And in developing countries where we have many young people still, and we have a large proportion of our potential workforce that is either not in the labor force or not employed, this is a very, very dramatic and serious concern. Finally, in terms of the other tendencies of inequality, there is a major issue with respect to the gender divide. The pandemic has brought this out in another particular way, which is that the neoliberal philosophy that has guided economic policy making for the last 20, 30 years has really undermined any kind of social recognition or appreciation of a huge amount of the work done by women, unpaid in homes and in communities, and underpaid by society, because care work is not really seen as work in the same way. It's not seen as productive work. It's not seen as valuable in the same way. Uh, all our societies have massively undervalued care. Care workers get a tiny fraction of the wages or salaries or incomes that are earned, let's say, in finance, which arguably is neither as socially desirable nor does it contribute in the same way. And yet, the power imbalances in our economy have ensured that this huge imbalance in terms of remuneration continues. The pandemic should have changed that. The pandemic should have made everyone aware how crucial care is and how, if you don't provide adequate care, if you don't have proper systems of health care, of all of these other care, then it's not just that your societies will suffer, your economies will suffer. The pandemic has been worst in the countries that do not have adequate health care, and it is creating economies that are not going to recover in the near future at all. Whereas countries that had much better healthcare systems, much better, uh, I would say, social solidarity and cohesion in terms of responding to the disease threat, those are the countries that have actually recovered more quickly, and their economies also are recovering more quickly and are dealing with it better. So these all, in a sense, are the context in which we have to look at the concerns, but it also means that it tells us something about the possible directions in which we can go. We clearly need much more significant fiscal expansion across the developing world. That expansion has to be led by public spending rather than by tax cuts. And it has to be public spending, putting money in the hands of the people who are more likely to spend it, to generate multiplier effects, to increase their consumption. And it has to be public spending that is geared to ensuring a properly functioning care sector in which universal provision of good quality care is provided to all who need it. And this is not just healthcare, but it also includes education, it includes a whole range of elderly care, of therapeutic care, of all kinds of things that we don't often factor in adequately in terms of what we want for our societies. There is potential, it requires political will. And unfortunately, at the moment, there isn't that political will. But I don't think it's all immutable. I think these things can be changed. And so with sufficient pressure, we're much more likely to generate changes that would actually allow this rather dismal context to have a better outcome. This is a big difficulty. So developing countries, we face two kinds of constraints. One is the external constraint, a global architecture that really doesn't allow this kind of imaginative thinking. There are all kinds of issues with external debt, especially now even privately held debt with bond markets and so on, and concerns about what level will actually not create a debt crisis and how we can deal with countries that have got excessive debt. There are concerns about basically inadequate resources, especially now that exports are collapsing with the global collapse. And for that, very clearly, we need a much more supportive multilateral community. We need a global issue of SDRs. I would say at least $1 trillion worth of SDRs to be distributed to every country according to its quota so that there's no favoritism, shall we say, or clientelism in such distribution. We need the ability of developing countries to put in capital control so that they're not subject to the whims of either credit rating agencies or very short-term oriented global finance, which is not interested in promoting long-term development in these countries. So we need that global architecture. But even more than that, we need a change in the mindset of our policymakers. Too many of them are completely, I would say, brainwashed by the Washington consensus still, when in fact people in Washington seem to have moved away from that. So I think we really need to create public pressure to show the stupidity of fiscal austerity in a time like this when demand has collapsed. And when, if you actually put in public spending to deal with both the demand collapse and the problem of supply chains for existing for essential commodities, you will not get inflation. You need not get balance of payments problems. You can actually do this. But creating that public pressure is absolutely essential because governments are not going to do this on their own. I think that's very clear. There is too much neoliberal thinking within most developing country governments. And they are that also, I would argue, too much in the thrall of the financial markets. So unless there is sufficient pressure from the people coming from the other side, this is not likely. I would say that we have to recognize our strengths. In fact, people do have strengths and popular pressure can make a difference. So if we can generate enough of public outcry to give that kind of public pressure, then I think we will see changes, even in these macroeconomic policies. A general fear that, there is a tsunami coming of technological change and now also of different behaviors, which is going to completely transform the potential for productive work. And there is a widespread fear among working classes that there just simply won't be any jobs. I think that this is a fallacy. It's a fallacy because, the distribution of employment has always been a function of your global trade, of technology, and all of these things. But the level of employment is very much a function of what public policy does, and macroeconomic policy in particular. when we think of things that can be done, there are so many activities which are still underprovided, especially in the developing world. And care is a very classic example of this. Care activities, if you take, I did a quick back of the envelope calculation, for example, a couple of years ago. If every country provided just Sweden levels of care in terms of the care workers per population, and I took very few, I took healthcare workers, I took those catering to the elderly, and those catering to young children below the age of 3. So it's a very small category of care. There are many more other kinds of care work which are underprovided, whether it is therapies or psychological treatments and so on and so forth. But I just took those. If you take that proportion of population, care workers to population as currently exists in Sweden, and apply that to the projected population of the world in different regions, depending on their demographic distribution and so on, in 2030, you would need 340 million more jobs. That's the kind of under provision of care we are doing. And it's because we as societies do not value care as something that is important. It's left to be done within households, unpaid, untrained, as if early childhood training is not something that those who are doing should be actually trained to do. As if looking after the elderly is just something that can be done by any family member, when many of them need very specialized attention because there are all kinds of special diseases or dementias or other things which require careful attention and care. So if we simply provide adequate levels of care, we can generate huge quantities of employment. The other area which has always been a great employer and which also enhances human happiness, I would say, is broadly what you can call the creative economy. And when you think of it, I mean, there is always a potential for entertainment in various ways. And of course, entertainment can be of the very high art, high classical kind, or it can be lowbrow. It can be for ordinary people. It can be folk entertainment. But it definitely enhances quality of life. It unleashes people's creative energies. There are so many things that people could do to express themselves, which would add to the richness and enjoyment of life by the rest of the population. There's no reason for these jobs ever to come down. The only reason they come down, or the only reason that they are not available, is because we rely on the market to deliver them for us, and markets do not. If we can actually generate sufficient surpluses because of higher labor productivity and automation and so on in all of these other sectors, why are we not channelizing those surpluses into investing in these activities? Because we allow those who get those surpluses to keep them. We don't tax them. We are allowing multinationals to get away with murder in paying almost no tax through what is called base erosion and profit shifting their profits to low tax jurisdictions. We are allowing the extremely wealthy, the top 0.01% of the population in most of our countries, to shift their money around and effectively pay no tax, to disguise. And many countries don't even have wealth tax. My own country, India, doesn't have a wealth tax at the moment. So we really need to bring back minimal taxation, I would say minimal taxation, that first of all makes multinationals pay their fair share of taxes, the same as domestic companies pay. And secondly, imposes a wealth tax to prevent this obscene inequality of wealth. This will actually allow us to spend public spending on these different kinds of activities, all of which will be highly employment intensive. Both the care and the creative economies are highly employment intensive. Technology assists them, it never replaces them, human beings. If it's employment intensive, there will be very strong multiplier effects of increasing employment in these sectors. And so you will get a virtuous cycle. I think it's a real failure of our imagination that we think that whatever is now will have to continue. And whatever system that we have created, which is entirely market driven, is the only one that we can ever have. So once we shift out of that and realize that this is a really small phase of human history which has done this, and we can change this. Anything created by human minds can also be changed by human minds. Once we realize that, there is massive potential for actually providing productive employment and increasing quality of life for the whole population. You know, within the care economy, there are very specific kinds of training that are required. And I think many of us forget how very skilled that training has to be. Whether it is psychotherapy, whether it is, care of the very young, whether it is care of the elderly, all of which are going to become more and more important in future. These require very specialized training. That we also need much more research into the kinds of illness or the kinds of other uh, ailments that might afflict them. We need to think of how to deal with differently abled people as they grow older. We need to think of how we can make children of different categories learn in different ways in a new world in which the learning is no longer the old textbook-based learning. All of this in turn means that there's a whole ecosystem required just to enable that final caregiver. There's an ecosystem of research, of infrastructure, of other support, logistical support, of assistance. All of these are required just to deliver that final caregiver. If we value and respect those final caregivers, we will actually enable a very large, significant expansion of employment, which in that case, once you generate that employment, you will find that the needs for training will emerge automatically. That's one of those areas where, in fact, markets do respond. Once those gaps are clear, then, in fact, the need for that training becomes evident and institutions come up to provide that training. These things don't happen because the people at the top want it. These things happen because of public pressure. And through history, we have seen this. Major progressive social change has come about because people have made it impossible for states and governments not to give certain rights for citizens or provide certain kinds of spending. And where there hasn't been that pressure, we haven't got it. So I think the job of economists and others is to actually persuade people, or at least let them know that there are these options. The problem is that too often economics is presented as this very technocratic thing that ordinary people can't understand. And that's a very political ploy. That's a ploy that is used to prevent people from making demands and to feel that, oh, they don't understand it, and so they're not supposed to be insisting on certain things. We have to go out there and show that, in fact, this is not rocket science. It's really quite straightforward, that these economic decisions, these choices about public spending have huge distributional consequences. And those distributional consequences are political. The choice is a political choice. So I think changing people's attitudes is a very important part in terms of pressurizing states to move to not just more rational responses. I think one of the big problems today is that we have very little time. We seem to think that, oh, well, there's a pandemic, now we'll get a vaccine, then everything will be all right again. No, we are heading towards a series of major health stresses, not just this particular pandemic, but various other zoonotic diseases which are coming about because of our changed lifestyles. We are already in the midst of very significant alterations in climate and in environmental disasters, many of which are going to become uncontrollable. We are going to, within certainly the next 2 decades, we will see large parts of very populated coastal areas no longer able to exist as cities or as areas of human settlement. We are going to see big desertification. We're going to see climate refugees coming about in a way that we simply can't begin to imagine. And some of this has already started in some of our countries. In the South Asian region, some of this is already happening. It's not just the occasional crazy weather events which are a sign of this. There are systematic changes that are making certain areas uncultivable, certain areas unlivable, and all of these are going to have huge requirements for not just adapting to these changes, but doing something to prevent further disaster. This cannot be done without public spending. And it cannot be done without coordinated, globally coordinated public spending. So An international regime is very important, but it can only come about when there's sufficient pressure at national levels as well. I think some global leaders are recognizing this. It's very interesting that the Roman Catholic Pope is coming up with very progressive encyclicals and statements which actually recognize the situation of the global economy and what needs to be done. It's interesting that people are talking about a new social contract, whether at the head of the IMF or even in many other places which I never thought I would hear it. So we should not be, what shall I say, we should not be uh, intimidated into silence by people who tell us, oh, it's impossible because the politics is against us. It's true that currently the politics is against us in most countries, but these things change. The politics is not written in stone, it's not immutable. And it is possible with sufficient public recognition of the importance of these major policy changes. The sheer survival of the species may well depend on it. It is possible still to enable change, I would argue. Social movements can all play a very important role, and in fact, they're essential. But not trade unions in the older traditional format, you know, the largely male organized workers in organized industry, but much wider coalitions of all workers, which recognize different kinds of work, underpaid, unpaid work done by women, etc. So we need coalitions of workers, associations of workers, recognizing the many, many different kinds of work, home-based work and other work, etc., to actually make this a wider movement. That's the first point. And I think that, you know, this is a period of obviously a very deep crisis. And let's face it, things are going to get much worse before they get better. But it is also a period of opportunity. And I do believe that humankind steps back from the brink. I do believe this is a brink. I mean, this seriously, I'm not joking when I say that this is that we are on the cusp of existential threats for humanity. We may not survive as a species. I think humanity has shown that it has a willingness to survive and it will do what it takes. And I think doing what it takes requires cooperation. It requires coordinating with others. It requires social solidarity. Societies have not survived when they have not shown social solidarity. So with these, I do believe humanity will step back from the brink. Now, how does that happen? I don't think change comes necessarily only from the direction where you're looking for it. Big changes have come from unexpected directions, but they have always come when there has been a broader groundswell of public thinking, of people believing or accepting or recognizing certain things. And so I think it's so important for these ideas about the need for a global Green New Deal, about the real threats posed by climate change, about the kinds of different kinds of shocks, whether from zoonotic disease or from some other unexpected shock and so on, that can affect us, and the need to create societies that are resilient to those shocks. Those messages, as they spread, and they are spreading, whether states try to suppress and repress them or not, these ideas are spreading. When they spread sufficiently, there will be the kind of churning and the ferment that generates wider public pressure for these changes. I do believe this is going to happen. Not immediately, perhaps not next year, but it's going to happen. And so I'm not ultimately pessimistic for the future. I don't believe we're heading for a complete dystopia of mass unemployment, deep inequality, terrible natural surroundings and environmental disasters and so on. I think humanity will actually be able to change those.